welcome to our fireside chat with Camille Stewart Gloucester on challenges and opportunities in today's cyber landscape. And trust me, there are quite a few. I'm your host, Judy Germano, a distinguished fellow and senior fellow at the NYU Center for Cybersecurity and the Reese Center on Law and Security, and an adjunct professor of law at NYU School of Law. And I will be joined today by Camille Stewart Gloucester, who is a powerhouse in the field, a strategist, attorney, and executive who focuses on technology, cyber, national security, and foreign policy issues. We are hosted today by the Reese Center on Law and Security at NYU School of Law, the Center for Cybersecurity at NYU School of Law and NYU Tandon School of Engineering, and Women Leaders in Cybersecurity at NYU. And special thanks to Rachel Goldbrenner, the executive director of the Reese Center, for having the initiative to make today happen, and also thanks to Mariana Kozek and Will Emmons. And now I introduce you to Camille Stewart Gloucester, who has held significant roles at the White House, the Department of Homeland Security, Google, and Deloitte. She was our first Deputy National Cyber Director in the United States for Technology and Ecosystem, serving at the White House from 2022 to 24, and advising the president and leading efforts to create new cybersecurity policies as the world continues to evolve and change, including in just the last week, which we will discuss. During Camille's tenure, there were some major changes that in cybersecurity advancement and directions that we can talk about, including a new national cybersecurity strategy, a national cyber workforce and education strategy, and an executive order on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of AI. Prior to her time in government, Camille also served as Google's global head of product security strategy, and before that as head of security policy and election integrity for Google Play and Android. She also led cyber diplomacy, technology policy, privacy, and technical areas in her work for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and has worked at Deloitte and elsewhere. And you can find her bio on her super cool, very impressive website. Look for her name and you'll find Camille and her awesome bio. So thank you so much for making time for us. I know you've been jet setting around the nation, if not the world. And thanks for taking a pause so we could have a cup of coffee today, Camille.
Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. You have to bring your own coffee because we're virtual, but thank you.
Fair.
It's time. I owe you one. So let's talk. You've had a really awesome career. And one of the fun things about cybersecurity and also being a lawyer is there are so many different things that we can do with this background. We know it's a central component of national security, but tell us your story. How did you get started in this?
Yeah, so I always knew I wanted to be a lawyer for some reason. I had my parents sign contracts every time they made me a promise. And that started really early. But my dad is also a computer scientist. And so I used to sit in the back of his computer science classes and tinker on computers. And so most of my academic career was me searching for a way to blend the two. I went to a cybersecurity company after law school and was doing a lot of their intellectual property work, their cybersecurity legal work, and then co-managing their security operations center. And it was there that I had this epiphany moment that one of the reasons I love the law is the complexity of the challenges, the opportunity to kind of understand the landscape and apply what exists to the challenge at hand, and then identify where there are gaps. And that's all there were in cybersecurity was gaps. We had no law, we had no policy. There was just so much opportunity to be creative with how we apply things that exist, but also identify places where existing law, existing frameworks wouldn't apply. And I've spent my career kind of doing that work, maybe not always in a traditional legal role, but kind of going back and forth between policy roles, strategy roles, and using that background to enrich the discussion on security teams.
Awesome. And in your work in government, if you could just share with us a little bit about the role of the Office of the Cyber Director.
Yeah. So the Office of the National Cyber Director is the newest cyber agency and a new agency within the executive office of the president. And the cyber director is tasked to be the chief cyber advisor for the president. And the way that it's organized is that there are four main departments within the organization. One focused on federal cybersecurity, which was dual-hatted by the federal CISO. One focused on strategy and budget. One of the big priorities for the office was making sure the priorities we set had the money to go along with it. We all have seen an unfunded mandate. Those are no fun. So how do we pair the resources with the priorities? Traditional cyber operations, critical infrastructure, that kind of went into the National Cybersecurity Branch, was the third one. And then I led all of our emerging technology, supply chain security, and cyber workforce work. And the Office of the National Cyber Director really sets the priorities, convenes the interagency to align and deconflict the authorities that we have. There are a lot of rich authorities across the interagency, across the government, and they intentionally overlap, but that can also cause duplication of efforts. It can cause, resources to be strained. And this was an opportunity to really leverage a seat at the White House to look across not only the national security implications, but the economic security implications, the human implications, innovation, and really thinking about the richness of how technology shows up in our environment and what the digital ecosystem could be, to set priorities, engage the private sector, and kind of lead how the federal government moves on cyber and technology issues.
And it seems like one of the challenges in such a role is bringing the different stakeholders together, understanding the different perspectives, which happens in companies as well. Do you have any advice on the best way to do that, whether in the private or the public sector?
So one of the things I'm most encouraged by in the landscape currently is the penchant towards true collaboration. In the past, we used to talk about public-private partnerships in a way that was very like, throw some threat indicators across the fence and, send you a little data here and there. But what I've seen is a real move towards true collaboration, which means coalescing and conversing about the implications of what you want to do at the beginning, right? Like the policies that we wrote while I was in the Office of the National Cyber Director really were a collaborative effort with the private sector, with our state and local partners, with civil society, to understand the breadth of the challenge, the breadth of the opportunities, and how we could leverage policy, leverage federal procurement, leverage all of the federal powers to be able to advance that and empower the private sector to do their part as well.
So our chat today is called Challenges and Opportunities in Today's Cyber Landscape, which is a little fancier than my alternative title, the good, the bad, and the gnarly in cybersecurity, or what scares the heck out of you on any given day. In terms of the landscape, the good and the bad, or challenges and opportunities, what are the things that you see as most significant today? I'll ask you that question in 3 more days and you can give a different answer, but let's talk about today.
Yes, just for today. The fun thing about this space is that most issues are a double-edged sword. So there's so much opportunity in AI, both just from an innovation perspective and how it can make our lives more efficient and effective, but also AI for cybersecurity, anomaly detection, and how it can enhance the way that we secure technology. But also on the other side, securing AI is a difficult challenge. It allows for more sophisticated social engineering attacks. And, we've seen AI generated deep fakes and audio and things like that being used and weaponized against us for elections and other issues. So, most things are a double-edged sword. Nation state activity and cybercrime are continual challenges. Ransomware is a continual threat vector. And like I said, with AI being able to generate social engineering attacks that really target people allows for ransomware attacks to be even more effective. We're still struggling with supply chain attacks. I will talk about this, but the Chevron reversal is going to cause a lot of challenges for how we do our jobs as well. Quantum poses opportunities and risks. There is a lot of opportunity and risk in cyber education and making sure that we have a robust workforce and that people have the cyber skills that they need to navigate life, but also to step into a multitude of careers that we have open in the cyberspace. Public-private collaboration is one of the positives. It's a real opportunity for us to get our hands around these issues in a much more fulsome way and to bring to bear the strengths that are inherent in government and in the private sector. And I'm really also excited about a lot of the organizations that are springing up to provide technical expertise to policymakers, especially in Congress, like Tech for Congress and things like that, that are allowing technologists to, one, understand the policy process, but also to lend that expertise to our policymakers. Those are a few things.
Awesome. Well, quite a few. I think we could have a whole session on any one of those. I'm going to jump into artificial intelligence just because we got a number of questions from the audience about that, and they're excited to hear from you. And since you mentioned it, also I'll just mention for others, if in joining us today, if you haven't put in questions in advance, you can use the Q&A function to submit questions, and we'll do our best, though we've had quite a few to get through. So, but on our AI, so one question was just what even is it and how do we describe it? And I think you'll agree that this is actually a technology that's been around for many years, and the term AI or artificial intelligence was first coined back in the 50s by a group of researchers from Dartmouth, Harvard, IBM, and Bell Tech Labs. And the point is to build a machine that could mimic human intelligence or human brain function. And then some years later, in 2012, the idea of the neural network was sort of rocked the AI world for how to learn skills by finding statistical patterns in this enormous amounts of data. And then I think we've all lived through a massive shift once again with really, it started in about 2018 with large language models that were helping systems to train. But then as generative AI kind of fell into everybody's laps, literally on their laptop computers, with ChatGPT being introduced, it's really changed kind of where we're going, I'd say. Some of the questions, lots of different variations, but audience members have asked, will it help? Will it hurt? What does it mean? And what is the impact on national security?
Yeah, I mean, just like any technology, it has the power to help and to hurt. It depends on how we wield it. There are a lot of opportunities to enhance our cybersecurity. We've already been, to your point of AI being around for a long time, we've been using it for things like anomaly detection. But there are a lot of studies being done on how generative AI and other AI ML tools can be used to advance cybersecurity. OpenAI and Anthropic have been seen in a lot of commentary, whether on podcasts or in the media, talking about how they're using their own models to advance their cybersecurity. And so there's a lot of opportunity there to advance our national security interests, our individual security interests, to secure our organizations, leveraging these models. That said, there's a lot of work to be done to educate people on how to use it, how to contextualize the information that they're getting, how to build rules for organizations on how they should leverage it. If there is an organization out there right now that does not have any guidance for their employees on how to use AI, you need to do it ASAP because they're using it regardless, right? ChatGPT is on everyone's computer, and you should be thinking about, if you get an enterprise license so that proprietary information is being controlled a little bit better, or how to just kind of control and regulate and give people guidance on how to use it. So there's a lot there, but just like how we're using it, malicious actors are using it, and they will use it to scale attacks. And I think the most obvious example, and I'm sure we'll talk about this as well, is using AI to create deep fakes or to create fake audio or fake images, and using that to confuse people or to change narratives. And so AI has a lot of opportunity for good, and you've seen a lot of the good that it has been used for, but we have to be cognizant and aware and proactive about making sure we have responsible and trustworthy implementations of AI, and that we have the guardrails necessary to protect us from the harms that are on the horizon.
And things like changing narratives and propaganda have existed long before computers.
Yes.
But now with AI and deep fakes, what are some concerns that exist now that didn't exist prior to deep fakes being so readily available and
Yeah,
cheap?
scale and
Well,
impact. Yes. I mean, yeah. So in 2020, when I was working at Google and leading their election integrity program for the mobile business, I mean, shallow fakes were more concerning than deep fakes because they're easier to create, and they still are, but they're easier to create. And as long as there's some confusion, you've achieved your goal. And so, I mean, the thing we need to be concerned about is not that this is new, to your point, it's the scale and the reach and the difficulty in changing the narrative once people have seen the image, heard the audio, etc. Particularly if it reinforces an existing bias, an existing perspective, it can kind of make louder an echo chamber. And so, what we have to combat is the absence of the tools that people have to gut check and seek truth when they see things like this. And I mean, one of the biggest things that I think we need is a focus on critical thinking skills in schooling again. That will help us as we face a information landscape that will be clouded by things like shallow fakes, deep fakes, fake audio, and help us discern truth. And so, no, these things are not new. Propaganda has been waged against us for so long, but the scale and veracity of the information that's coming at people and the opportunity for it to seemingly come from a trusted source has given it new legs and makes it concerning.
right. And you mentioned shallow fakes also as cheap fakes. So just for the audience members who probably already
Yeah.
know this, but examples of just quick tweaking of a video, right? A couple
Yeah.
examples that came to mind was somebody in DC who, was accused of accosting somebody, but really just instead of moving toward them, move quickly, and it looked more like an attack as opposed to the actual, or changing something where it looks like someone
Yeah.
isn't
Putting somebody
speaking
else's face
clearly,
on. Yeah.
and
Hmm.
just
Exactly.
and it is, the a concern that it is readily available. But I think you make a terrific point, Camille, in terms of the importance in schools and for young people, but I'd say for all ages,
Yeah.
understanding the questioning the veracity of what we see and what we hear, right? As attorneys, we're trained for believing, seeing evidence, and if a picture or video, it has greater veracity, but the world has changed. And so
Yeah.
understanding some of that, I think, is really, really important. And do you have examples with regard to national security, in particular, how AI could both help us and be a concern? I know you sort of already touched on some of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the cybersecurity implications, right? I mean, how we protect ourselves from a cybersecurity perspective, AI can be a huge tool for that. It can help scale our defenses, it can help scale the way we do cyber operations. It will also pose a threat, though, because our adversaries are using it as well. And so being prepared and understanding the potential threat vectors, leveraging AI and being able to meet the moment on combating that and mitigating its impact.
And we have a terrific question from the audience about what is the solution to combating deep fake videos and audios, if you have thoughts about that.
I mean, there's no one solution. It'll be a multifaceted suite of solutions. One is that critical thinking and coping skills for people to be able to discern truth and ask questions and interrogate the things that they see. Part of it will be tech companies and other organizations leveraging, metadata and other tools to be able to detect when something has been manipulated. Part of it will be media reporting very quickly when something has been manipulated and is communicating untruths. I mean, it will definitely be a multifaceted solution set to be able to combat deepfakes and shallow fakes.
Right. And on the tech side, there is some great work being done, including through the Content Authenticity Initiative that companies like Adobe and TruePic
Yes.
and the BBC and New York Times and others have signed on to help understand how do we authenticate at the time of creation, and understand like strawberries in the market if they have the organic label or not, to help people better discern. And there's also other technology that can use other ways to assess, right? Leverage AI in terms of multiple data points to help understand time and place. But I will confess just to you, Camille, and maybe to the hundreds of people joining us, I've had heard of false, AI of my own voice. I watched it being created. I thought, oh, good
Mm,
Lord, that really does sound like me. It's very difficult. And that's why I do think we need to uh, press the awareness, the concern, because cyber criminals are using it, nation state
yeah.
actors are using it, and helping people to become vigilant, but also learn technology that can, or apply technology that can help us as well. And then I guess that turns us to a question about regulation. Does the pace of AI regulation, is it keeping up, or how does it compare to the pace of AI technology creation? Not just with deepfakes, but generally.
It does not keep up and cannot keep up. And arguably it should not keep up, right? There's a lot of opportunity for us to regulate AI, and we should do that. Much of the work that needs to be done, though, is already being done. The goal is to address the root causes, and we have a lot of frameworks in a lot of specific contexts that can be applied to AI, and we should start with that work, identify gaps, and then fill gaps. For example, AI as applied in the finance sector, very important. How it's being leveraged to make decisions and to impact how you get a loan, this, that, and the third, is a place where people have a lot of concerns and a lot of questions. There are already structures and frameworks that regulate how those decisions are made, when they're audited, that kind of thing. And leveraging that allows us to make immediate changes and address the concerns that we have. And then where there are gaps, identifying those and filling the gaps. And so I think that we have a lot of the frameworks that can help us. Like, if we start legislating for specific technologies, we will never, ever be able to keep up. But if we really do the work to identify what are the root challenges we seek to address and build frameworks that are technology agnostic where we're able, and be able to apply them to every new manifestation and then bridge the gap where there are gaps, we will move a lot faster. And what I hope that we're seeing is more of that. That will mean we need things like privacy legislation and some other big pieces of legislation for us to have those frameworks. But as we have them in specific high risk contexts like healthcare, like finance, you see a lot of rulemaking around critical infrastructure. Those things will help us address the places where we are most concerned about AI's impact on our daily lives and the decision making that's happening there.
Mhm. And I imagine to get the regulation right, even if it's tech agnostic, it does require strong communication and understanding between the lawmakers and the executive branch and the tech companies. Is that
Yes.
relationship functioning as it should, or are there ways that we can improve and strengthen it?
Oh, it can always get better. I think there's a lot of good work going on right now. You've seen that in the development of the AIEO, in the convenings that have happened in the lead up to the release of that EO. There's been a lot of conversation about how, for example, OpenAI did not release a capability because they were afraid of how it might impact the bevy of elections that are happening across the world this year. So there's a lot of good communication that's happening and pushing organizations to think more globally about the impact of their technologies. That said, there's always more work to be done to truly understand the implications of how a technology might be limited or mitigate an impact by a regulation or a policy decision. And the bodies that have been created, like the JCDC and NSA has a collaboration body with the private sector, and offices like the Office of the National Cyber Director allow for that continued conversation, but there does need to be more. And as people move back and forth between government and industry, I think that gets a little bit more seamless, and those trust relationships that are necessary to have open dialogue continue to evolve. But there is work to be done, but we have come a mighty long way.
And in terms of what is out there now, we have October last year, the White House's executive order on the safe, secure, trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence, which gives a rather comprehensive vision for how the US may mobilize to meet the implications of AI. But can you talk to us just a little bit about that order, what exists presently, and where you think it may go from there in terms of regulation in the US?
Yeah. So first it was the executive order, and then there was an OMB memo that kind of told the federal government how it should organize itself around AI use in the federal government. So a lot of understanding where AI was being used, cataloging it, putting in rules and requirements. I think that's really important. The federal government usually and should lead by example. It's a great opportunity to hold their vendors to account, to model good behaviors, to test frameworks, to test tools. And so the federal government is doing that work. That was tasked in the EO. The EO also tasks a lot of research. It talks about security, it talks about safety, it talks about ethics, it talks about preventing bias. And a lot of agencies across the federal government were tasked to identify a AI officer, chief AI officer. So someone is responsible for understanding how AI and data are being used within a given agency. Those folks can be convened and held to account, and be able to be strategic about policy development within the federal government. There's a lot of money being invested. The National Science Foundation and NIST are both doing a lot of research and work and working with external partners and awarding money to identify how AI can be used in given contexts. There's a lot of workforce investment. There's an AI tech surge that was happening in the federal government alongside a lot of the cyber workforce work that was also happening, but was specifically targeting AI and data talent, like folks who had that expertise, to bring them into government across agencies. There's not an agency across the federal government that isn't using AI or doesn't need to be well positioned. And so how do we surge up around that talent? And that push, led by the White House, led by the Chief of Staff's office in particular, was a real clear signal for how important that is, and really allowed for a influx of resources and talent to be able to have a bunch of job fairs and things like that. And so a lot of the work that you have seen is a lot of landscaping and setting of responsible standards and principles that outline where we should go, setting up infrastructure within the government, pushing for R&D, that kind of thing. And so the AIEO is a really good first step. I believe today MITRE put out 9 suggestions for what the next administration or the next cycle, some things that should be done to advance AI in the coming months. There's still lots of work to be done, right? The EU put out their AI Act, and it created a lot of requirements, and the US needs to do a little bit more. In the wake of Chevron, which I'm sure we'll talk about, it'll be interesting to see how things like an EO, an executive order, and executive branch policy can govern how we control something like AI, and how we interpret rules for some of the existing bodies and frameworks that I was talking about earlier, to make sure that they are able to adapt to a changing technological environment. And so there will be a lot more work to be done, but I'm very proud of what was in the AIEO, because it set a baseline for what we should expect, where we should make investments, and then directed the funds and the resources and the personnel necessary to really organize the federal government around this change that will really dictate how we as a society operate in the years to come.
Great. And on the national security front, or maybe national cyber strategy front, there's an audience question about cyber criminals leveraging AI, who come from outside of US borders and often from
Yeah.
countries from which we cannot extradite them, or don't have partnerships through mutual legal assistance treaties or otherwise. Do you have any thoughts on how the US may approach that cyber crime challenge generally, but also particularly with regard to the prevalence of AI used by cyber criminals?
Yeah, I mean, much the same as they're doing now. There's a lot of work going on with the ransomware task force. DOJ has been leveraging a lot of authorities to actually identify who are the cyber criminals behind many of these attacks and find ways to extradite them if possible, or at least to mitigate and cut off their resources, whether that's cryptocurrency or other funding streams. We've been getting really creative with how we address these cyber criminals. But yes, it is very tough when they are shielded by nation state governments in some cases, when they are in countries where there is no extradition. And AI will only amplify their ability to do that. I mentioned at the top that social engineering attacks like phishing emails become even more sophisticated, even more targeted, and allow for access to perpetrate things like a ransomware attack or a supply chain attack in more targeted ways. And so we have to be thoughtful about the training that we give to our employees, the training that we give to folks operating systems and that have access to be able to mitigate for the impacts of AI.
And in terms of how we create and implement a national cyber strategy, can you just share a little more background about maybe some historic lessons or key issues that help to inform such a thing?
Yeah. So this cyber strategy is novel in that rather than identifying all of the challenges or the threats or the actors that we needed to combat to shore up our national security and be more cyber secure, we set a affirmative vision for what we wanted the digital ecosystem to be. We thought about in this world where technology is underpinning so much of our society and our access to services and is so connected to opportunity and economic development and growth and um, thriving as a society, as a global society, or domestically here in the US. How do we set that affirmative vision, and then what work needs to be done to achieve that? How do we look at emerging technologies and make sure that they are secure by design, secure by default, or privacy, consider privacy by design, and make sure that they are being built in a way that mitigates the work that we have to do? How do we invest in research and development so that we are getting ahead? How do we secure our global supply chains? And yes, how do we combat nation state actors and adversaries of all kinds? But the nice thing about this strategy, the novel thing about this strategy was setting that affirmative vision. And to achieve that, it articulates two shifts. One, shift the responsibility from the small players, small governments, small companies, individuals, to the bigger players that are able to bear the burden, cloud providers, big tech companies, the federal government. They have the resources to implement security, to prioritize security, to their implementation of security practices disseminate further. So how do we make sure that we're pushing that to the bigger players as much as possible? And then leveraging market incentives to drive towards that secure by design, secure by default feature. How do we use things like cyber insurance and software liability to drive the industry towards not first to market, but security as a feature, security as a priority, a security as a part of the innovation life cycle. And so development of that strategy required close collaboration with the private sector. I mean, we met with hundreds of private sector representatives, civil society representatives, academics, to develop the content, to refine the content, to understand the challenge and opportunity space. And then on the other side of that, the implementation of the strategy has been a collaborative endeavor as well, hosting convenings to refine what a plan would look like to implement certain things, to understand opportunities for new projects. Like software liability in and of itself is a huge project, a huge endeavor that a lot of lawyers have been involved in. There have been a lot of legal convenings, a lot of academic convenings to understand what is the potential for a software liability structure. What should it mimic? Should it be completely novel? And it's a hard challenge. So there's a lot of interesting work going on, and it has taken a great amount of collaboration, not only within the federal government across the agencies, but internationally with our partners at a state and local level, and then of course with industry and civil society.
Right. So let's talk about Chevron. June 28th, 2024. So just a couple of weeks ago, the Supreme Court struck down the Chevron doctrine or deference, which stood for 40 years and allowed federal agencies to use their own expertise to interpret ambiguities in the law. And some people have said that this decision, which erodes some power, perhaps, and deference given to the agencies, will, the different words have said it threatens the framework on cybersecurity. It creates an uphill battle for executive branch efforts to regulate cybersecurity. One author described it as a seismic effect or even a nail in the coffin on regulation by the executive branch, and said, no, toss cybersecurity rulemaking to Congress and to the courts, as opposed to agencies who on one hand are seen as experts and helpful, and on the other hand are seen as not elected and not judges. So what does it all mean? Do you think that is it a lot of hype, or is this actually let's say a nail in the coffin, or some lesser seismic effect? Okay.
Yeah, I hope it's not as far as a nail in the coffin, and I doubt it will be. It has the potential to be, but I think this is more of a definite shift in operations. Most of the cybersecurity work happens in the executive branch. The expertise does live there. And while there has been a lot of work to, support members of Congress, support the judicial branch with technical expertise, quite frankly, that is not their expertise, right? Very few members of Congress are engineers or have some kind of cybersecurity background or a technical background. Same thing with judges. And so to limit the ability for the executive branch to be able to create rulemaking around cybersecurity is a big hit. That said, this is probably not the area where there's a lot of intention for the courts to weigh in, or that Congress is not going to continue to look to the executive branch to create more detailed rulemaking. It'll require of Congress to be more detailed in the record as to their intention, as to just how much authority every executive branch agency has to be able to implement the legislation that they have created. They'll have to be a bit more detailed, which will mean more collaboration up front. It might mean a slowing of our ability to legislate, particularly in this area and other areas that are really complex. And that's not helpful, right? We already just talked about how slow it is for us to meet the pace of technology in terms of regulation and policy. And to slow that down even more is going to have an effect. What we'll probably see is business as usual, with some challenges starting to pop up. Organizations will either see cases in other contexts, healthcare, whatever, and use that to liken it to the requirements in cybersecurity, or just challenge them outright. And we will probably see more push towards voluntary requirements in the absence of the ability to be more forceful with the executive branch authorities. I think there will be a point at which we kind of balance it out. Either Congress will have to do a lot of legislating to kind of fill the gaps and to make sure that agencies like DHS and others have the authority they need to do the rulemaking. Like we've got CERCIA in the pipeline, which is the critical infrastructure cybersecurity rules that are currently being out for comment and being drafted. And so there are some really big things that they have called on the executive branch to do, but maybe haven't been detailed enough and might be called into question now that Chevron has been overturned. And so there is going to be a lot of work to make sure that cybersecurity progress continues to be made. But I will say that cybersecurity tends to be a nonpartisan issue. It tends to be a place where industry and others are aligned in its focus on, kind of getting it right. They're starting to recognize the business value there. And so hopefully it won't be as disruptive as a nail in the coffin, but I do think there will be a slowing of progress that could be pretty harmful.
And as we all jump in, with responsibility from the agencies, from Congress, from the courts, to figure out the right role of regulating cybersecurity, and hopefully with strong impact from the private sector who are on the front lines of trying to apply the regulations. Do you have advice on how we can better increase the expertise and education for lawmakers and judges who are increasingly facing these questions?
Yeah, I mean, we need to educate everybody on cyber in general. And I think in doing that, both at a, grade school education level, but just finding ways to mass educate people on cyber skills will help. A more realistic solution is funding for programs like Tech Congress that get technical expertise to members of Congress to help them be able to write legislation that contemplates the technical implications of the policy that they are writing. They will definitely need to continue to collaborate with industry to hear from industry on how a draft piece of legislation might impact them. I think trade associations are going to have to really step up on behalf of companies to kind of lay out how potential legislation will impact them and to help Congress really be specific about, as they draft legislation and as they think about the record and making clear what the guidance that the executive branch is able to give. The executive branch will have to be very collaborative as well. And so, I mean, it's just going to be a lot more work on all involved. And that's going to be the best way for us to equip members of Congress to be able to meet the moment, is to kind of executive branch, industry, everyone be telling them exactly what the implications of what they're trying to write, be proposing language, be participating in briefings and things like that, and members of Congress seeking out the technical expertise that they need to be able to write legislation that actually addresses the root causes.
Excellent points. And I do agree. I mean, I think, it's easy to say, oh, everyone needs to be more astute on cybersecurity, but we are all so vulnerable, individually, our institutions, our nation, our government. So, and as we shift in terms of the agencies are responsible, the lawmakers are responsible, the judges are responsible, it really does put the onus on all of us more holistically, in addition to the users. We actually just at NYU launched a program to train public company directors to become cyber scholars, and through an interactive sort of first of its kind with in-person and asynchronous Zoom webinars to help address, because we've said for years, it's important in the boardroom. So now we're offering, that, and NYU has a master's in cybersecurity risk and strategy program that for executives who can get a master's degree. And then I do think, important work in the schools and for young people. And I'm going to applaud the Supreme Court of New Jersey. They saw AI as a big issue, saying it's going to impact the legal profession. It's going to impact us as judges, as well as lawyers practicing, as well as pro bono people. What do we do and how do we address it? And they formed a task force of judges and staff and advisors who are very happy to speak with the judges about these issues. And I've been honored to serve on that committee, but I think that that's a really important thing that other courts should have the foresight that the New Jersey Supreme Court had to do these kinds of programs. And there are people like Catherine Forrest, a former federal judge herself, who does a lot of outreach in that way. So I think there's work happening, but much more work to be done in this area.
I like that model that you mentioned. I think there's a lot of appetite by cyber professionals to volunteer and support. Craig Newmark, the founder of Craigslist, has done a lot of investing and talking about cyber civil defense and us all like meeting our responsibility to support cybersecurity of the nation. And I think that there are a lot of cyber practitioners who would volunteer for a committee like that to support judges, to support member of Congress. So I like that model. And I think you're right. If more courts adopted that, we would be a lot better off.
No. Another area that I'd like to talk about, you had mentioned earlier, Camille, the your work on supply chain issues, and how that is an increasingly significant problem. And what are the largest vulnerabilities in U.S. supply chain networks that you see, and how can we address them?
Yeah. So one of the great things about the Biden-Harris administration is all of the infrastructure investments that have been happening. The bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Act, all of those are designed to invest in bringing infrastructure back to the US, to rebuilding infrastructure, to getting the workforce ready to meet the moment, to bringing chip development back to US soil, all of those things. And what we've seen in recent years is our supply chains are global. We don't have a lot of understanding of how we get the component parts to make technology or to make other critical goods. And that has caused us a lot of issues because that means that they are vulnerable. Vulnerable from the point of just disruption of access, but even more so vulnerable in terms of being attacked, being breached, being penetrated. And so one of the things that the administration has really focused on is how do we have, you know, more transparency in our supply chains? How do we bring more things to the US to be manufactured? So the Chips and Sciences Act gave money to companies like Intel or to allies, to companies like NVIDIA, to be able to build chips and to do semiconductor manufacturing and to build fabs, to be able to bring that work back to the United States and to create some more transparency and requirements. And so the supply chain issues are largely us not knowing what's going in them. I don't know if anybody remembers the Log4j incident, but I was at Google, and Log4j is an open source piece of code that's in so many things. And it was compromised, and everybody was trying to figure out if it was in their software and how to remediate it, and if it was in the software of their vendors. And quite frankly, the software of your vendors was more worrisome. Most people could not figure out, even if they could get a handle on their infrastructure, they could not figure out if their vendors were using Log4j and if they'd appropriately remediated it. And it caused a lot of late nights for folks working in cybersecurity. But it's a really great illustration of, on the software side, the lack of transparency and understanding what code is in your infrastructure and just how much of an impact that could have. It shut down operations. People were terrified to turn things on. People had to shutter and stop things to make sure that they weren't vulnerable to this bug. And, us understanding the work that went into remediating that catalyzed a lot of efforts to create more transparency in software. You'll hear things like software bill of materials, which is basically a catalog of all the software that's in your software so that you're able to identify when there's a vulnerability that's been named, if it's in the software that you have. So there are a lot of efforts to remediate and create transparency and make it easier to identify when you have an issue in your supply chain. And you'll also see it from a very physical perspective in things like um, the Colonial Pipeline um, attack and a few others that like showed that if part of your supply chain is shut down, it could really shut down your operations. And so um, there's a lot of work that's going on there, both from an infrastructure investment perspective, creating transparency, creating rules of the road, limiting foreign investment in supply chains in certain areas to limit the opportunity for attack and the visibility for nation state actors to be able to compromise component parts. And so there's a lot of good work going on there.
Sort of a follow on is we hear a lot in foreign policy discussions about China's superiority in certain technologies, including electric cars, some renewable energy. What is the government's cybersecurity strategy to step it up or ensure US competitiveness in technology overall?
Yeah, the US maintaining competitiveness, I would say.
Better
You know,
way to frame it.
yeah, yeah. Since China is making a lot of strategic investments in quantum and AI and all kinds of things to be able to get a capability that surpasses the innovation and richness of US innovation. And that concentration of funds, that government investment funds, have yielded them a lot of benefits. They've been able to make a lot of advancements, to build on the capabilities that others have created. And so a lot of the work through some of the infrastructure bills that I was talking about, like the Chips and Sciences Act, limits the ability for companies to sell certain things to China. We've been doing a lot of work to make it such that US innovation doesn't cede China's innovation and their ability to build on top of things. We've been making a lot of R&D investments, in the national cyber strategy, in the budget, in a lot of these bills. There is a lot of money being put into research and development to make sure that the US continues to innovate, that our national labs, that our universities have the resources that they need to continue to do the research and development that will allow us to remain at the forefront of innovation and spur economic development. And so, yes, China is making big investments. They are throwing money at it, throwing people at it. They are using tactics that we frown upon, stealing technology, intellectual property theft, all of that kind of thing. But we are doing a lot of work to make those things harder for them to do and to spur US investment in innovation.
And you mentioned earlier about attacks, ransomware attacks from outside the US, as well as you just mentioned the theft of intellectual property. We've seen critical infrastructure threats from different nation state actors or groups that seem to be condoned by nation states. What is the US cyber policy on cyber threats from nation state actors? And how do we define or at least discuss the line between cybercrime and cyber warfare to understand an appropriate and measured response? It's a pretty loaded question, but just a quick thought on that one. Again,
Well, so
we could
this
have
is,
a whole conversation on that one, I'd say.
I was gonna say, this is the right audience for it. I mean, this is the opportunity for this group as lawyers to help figure out how the law of armed conflict applies in this space. I mean, there is a thin line, if a line, often between cybercrime and cyber warfare. I mean, so many nation states are hiding their activities behind cybercrime, are leveraging cyber criminals or backing cyber criminals or creating shields for cyber criminals to be able to perpetrate attacks that help advance their ends. Cybercrime is often the starting place for something greater. And so the line between cybercrime and cyber warfare is hard to identify and usually is determined based on the impact. There's not a lot of international consensus on the point at which this has moved to armed conflict and it could result in a kinetic or physical response. But a lot of the decision making that goes into that is based on the impact. Is it to critical infrastructure? Does it stop operation? Does it harm human life? Um, what is the impact to the nation, to the people of the locale, and how hard was it to remediate? How pervasive was it? Did they shut down a dam in in one place in a small city? Did they shut down access to water for an entire region of the country? Those are the kinds of considerations, the scale and scope of impact, that would help determine whether or not something is a criminal act, whether it's an act of war, whether it's um, something that deserves a more physical response or just a cyber response in return, if it would get sanctions, that kind of thing. It's actually a really complicated calculus of factors and people within the government having a conversation about what other things are happening in the geopolitical context, what other things are happening in terms of relations with that nation that perpetuated the attack, or with that criminal organization that perpetuated the attack and their relationship to a nation state. So it's a really complicated set of questions and dynamics that you have to balance to understand where you would draw the line and how you would respond to something like that.
And we talked about the importance of, education and training and collaboration, and covered a lot of different topics there. But for folks in the audience who are interested in considering a career in cybersecurity, and also ensuring that we have well-rounded, multi-perspective, cyber teams, do you have any quick thoughts or advice on that, Camille?
Everyone should pursue cyber or feel open to pursuing a career in cybersecurity. There is no background that is not helpful to understanding the suite of challenges. Technology underpins everything. And so whether it is understanding the human psyche, or being skilled at training or marketing, or being an engineer, those skill sets are helpful in understanding the challenges and the opportunities inherent in technology use. And you should consider doing this work. If you go to NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, they have a nice website, which is like the National Institute for Cyber Education, I think. And they have a bunch of work roles that fall along a number of different skill sets and can help you identify what areas of cybersecurity you might want to work in and what kind of training you may or may not need to be able to make that transition and do that work. And so I encourage you to consider working in this space.
Camille, I have a long list more questions. The audience had more questions we didn't get to, but we covered as many as we could in the time that we have. I just want to thank you so very much for sharing your wisdom and insight. I would love to continue the conversation, since there's so much to cover. And I thank you for your service, both in government as well as your hard work in the private sector, and your latest adventures. So thank you again for making time with us. Thanks to the audience for joining us. And thanks again to the team at the Reese Center and the Center on Law and Security for bringing us together to make this happen. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone.